The council chamber of the Galactic Convergence was one of the largest rooms ever built by any living species. It floated in space on a station called Aurum 9, and its ceiling was made of clear crystal so that the stars could always be seen from inside. 312 species had seats in that chamber. Their chairs, platforms, tanks, and pods were arranged in a wide circle, each one built to fit a different kind of body. Some delegates breathed oxygen, some breathed methane. Some floated in liquid and spoke through sound waves that machines translated into common galactic speech. But on most days, they all agreed on one thing: the meetings were boring. That changed on the day High Warlord Scareth of the Vreth Dominion walked in. Scareth was tall, even by Vreth standards. His species had 4 arms, gray-blue skin like old metal, and eyes that were completely black from edge to edge. He wore his conquest armor, deep red plates with the names of 37 worlds carved into the chest piece. Worlds he had taken. Worlds that no longer had the right to say no to the Dominion. He walked to the center platform with slow, heavy steps, and he looked around the chamber the way a person looks at something that belongs to them. The chamber went quiet on its own. Scareth did not greet anyone. He did not bow. He simply activated the central hologram display and brought up a small blue-green planet spinning slowly in the middle of the room. "This is Sector 07, he said. "We are annexing it. I am informing the Council as required by the Convergence Agreement, Article 9. The annexation will begin in 6 of your standard days." A low murmur moved through the chamber. Delegates leaned toward each other and whispered. The planet in the hologram was covered in blue water and green-brown land. It had one large moon. It looked ordinary. It looked small. Councillor Brennack of the Orvani, who managed most of the day-to-day affairs of the chamber, looked at his records. He scrolled through the file for Sector 07 quickly. "The planet is listed as a primitive world," he said. "Pre-contact. No interstellar travel. No energy signature beyond basic chemical and early nuclear use. They are not a member species. Under convergence law, they have no protections." "Correct," Scareth said. He turned off the hologram. "Then there is nothing to discuss." He started to walk back toward his seat. "There is one small thing," said a voice from the far side of the chamber. Scareth stopped. The voice belonged to Ambassador Velshara of the Lethani. She was old, even for her species, and the Lethani lived a very long time. Her skin was pale white and slightly translucent. Her fingers were long and thin, and she always kept them folded on the table in front of her. She had been in this chamber for longer than most of the other delegates had been alive, and when she spoke, people listened, not because they agreed with her, but because she was almost always right. "I have studied the records of Sector 07, she said. Her voice was calm and even. "The species that lives there calls itself human. I would like to suggest that the Council at least review the historical file before we close this matter." Scareth turned to look at her. His black eyes showed nothing. "They have no ships," he said. "They have no energy shields. Their most powerful weapons are small nuclear devices that would not scratch the paint on a Vreth scout craft. There is nothing in their file worth reviewing." "Their history," Velshara said. "Not their weapons, their history." A few delegates chuckled softly. Councillor Brennack waved a hand. "Ambassador Velshara, I understand your concern, but the law is clear. Without interstellar capability, the species cannot be granted convergence protection. The Vreth Dominion has every legal right to proceed." Velshara looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once and folded her hands again. "Very well," she said quietly. "Let the record show that I raised the concern." "Noted," Brennack said. "The Council acknowledges the Vreth Dominion's intention to annex Sector 07, proceeding under Article 9. No objections filed." Scareth allowed himself a very small smile. He walked back to his seat, and the meeting moved on to other business. Velshara sat still and said nothing more, but her eyes stayed on the empty space where the little blue-green planet had been spinning in the hologram. She stayed that way for a long time. 6 days later, 3 Vreth conquest fleets entered the outer edge of the solar system that contained Sector Null 7. Each fleet was made up of 40 warships. The smallest of those ships was longer than the tallest building ever built on Earth. The flagship of the first fleet, a ship called the Eternal Dominion, was so large that it created its own gravity field when it moved through space. These were not scout ships or patrol ships. These were war machines. They had broken the defenses of entire star systems. They had reduced fortified moons to rubble. They had made species that had been flying through space for 1,000 years kneel down and give up. They were sent to take one small, unprotected, pre-contact world with no real military to speak of. It was, by every Vreth measure, overkill, but Scareth believed in sending a message. When other species saw how easily Earth fell, they would think twice before standing in the Dominion's path. Fleet Commander Urak stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion and looked at the planet growing larger on the screen. It was beautiful, he thought, in a simple way. The blue of the water was a very deep blue. The clouds moved in slow white spirals over the surface. It looked peaceful. It looked completely unaware. "Send the ultimatum broadcast," Urak said. The standard ultimatum broadcast was a message the Vreth had used on every world they had ever taken. It had been translated into every known language. It explained, very simply, that the Dominion had arrived and that the world below had 2 choices: surrender completely and be absorbed into the Dominion with minimal harm to the population, or resist and be destroyed. It had worked on every single world the Vreth had ever sent it to. Some worlds had surrendered in minutes. A few had waited hours. None had ever actually chosen to resist. Resistance was not rational when you were looking at 40 warships. The broadcast went out on all frequencies. It reached Earth in seconds. Urak waited. His crew waited. The standard response time was anywhere between a few minutes and a few hours, depending on how quickly the planet's leaders could be gathered. He expected fear. He expected confusion. He expected desperate attempts to negotiate or plead. He had seen it all before. What came back was none of those things. 11 minutes after the broadcast was sent, a signal came up from the planet below. The translation system processed it and put it on the main screen in Vreth script. Urak read it. Then he read it again. He turned to his communications officer. "Is the translation correct?" The officer checked. "Yes, Commander, word for word." Urak looked at the message a 3rd time. It was short. It had come from something called the United Earth Defense Command. It was signed by someone with the title of General, and it said, in clear and simple language, the following: "Transmission received. Your presence in this solar system is noted and considered an act of war. You have 48 of our standard hours to withdraw your forces completely. If your forces remain after that time, we will remove them. This is your only warning. Do not mistake our silence for fear." Urak stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he laughed. It started as a short, sharp sound and then grew into something louder. His crew laughed too. They laughed the way people laugh when they have just heard something so ridiculous that it does not even make them angry, it just makes them laugh. A primitive world. A species that had never left its own planet. A species with no fleet, no shields, no knowledge of the galaxy around them. And they had just told the Vreth Dominion, 3 full conquest fleets, 120 warships, that they had 48 hours to leave. Or else. Urak wiped his eyes and leaned back in his command chair. "Send no reply," he said. "Let them have their 48 hours. We will advance on schedule." On Aurum 9, the Council was watching the broadcast feed as a matter of routine. Observation of Vreth annexations was standard procedure. A few delegates were barely paying attention. Councillor Brennak was reviewing another file entirely. But Velshara was watching very closely. When the human response appeared on her screen, she read it slowly. She read it the way she read everything, carefully and without rushing. When she was done, she did not laugh. She did not smile. She simply opened the historical file for Sector Null 7 on her secondary screen and began reading it from the beginning. She read about wars that had lasted decades. She read about plagues that had killed hundreds of millions of humans and how the survivors had rebuilt. She read about famines, floods, and ice ages, and how the species had come through every single one of them. She read about a species that had been fighting itself for its entire recorded history and had somehow, against all reason, always found a way to keep going. She read for a long time. When she finally set the file down, she looked out through the crystal ceiling at the stars. She found the small yellow star of the human solar system. It was so far away it was just a dot. She looked at it for a long time. Then, very quietly, in a voice that only she could hear, she said one thing. "You have no idea what you just did." The 48 hours passed slowly on Orem 9. Most of the council delegates did not think about Earth at all during that time. There were other matters, trade agreements between the Senari and the Orvani, a border dispute near the Keth system, a long and very dull argument about fuel tariffs in the outer rings. The council had 312 species to manage and 10,000 problems to sort through at any given moment. One small, primitive, pre-contact world being absorbed into the Vreth Dominion was not even in the top 100 things anyone was worried about. But Velshara had not slept. She had spent the full 48 hours at her station, reading. She had gone through every piece of recorded data the Convergence had collected on the human species over the past 2 centuries of quiet observation. Most of it had been gathered by unmanned probe. Humans had not known they were being watched. The files covered their history, their biology, their wars, their politics, their art, their science, their religions, and their behavior under pressure. The more she read, the more still she became. By the time the 48 hours were up, she had stopped reading and was simply sitting with her hands flat on the table in front of her, staring at nothing. When the observation feed from the Vreth fleet came back online on the main council screen, only a handful of delegates were watching. Velshara was one of them. Councillor Brennak glanced at it briefly between other tasks. A young Kethani science delegate named Oris sat in the back of the chamber with a data pad, half watching, half doing something else. On screen, the Vreth fleet began its advance. Fleet Commander Urak had arranged his ships in the standard annexation formation, a wide crescent that moved toward the planet slowly and deliberately. It was designed to look overwhelming. It was designed to make whatever resistance existed on the surface understand, at a glance, that there was no point. The formation had worked exactly as intended on every world the Vreth had ever used it on. The fleet crossed the orbit of the outer planets. Nothing happened. It crossed the orbit of the large ringed planet that sat in the middle of the solar system. Nothing happened. It moved through the asteroid belt. Nothing happened. The humans, it seemed, had made their dramatic statement and were now doing nothing. Urak was not surprised. He had expected it. They had 48 hours to realize how foolish their message had been, and apparently they had spent that time coming to their senses. The fleet approached the large red planet, still nothing. Urak allowed himself to relax. This was going to be exactly as simple as he had always known it would be. Then the moon came into view. Earth's moon was a gray, rocky, airless body that orbited close to the planet. The Vreth records listed it as geologically dead. No atmosphere, no water, no life. It had no military value and no strategic importance. It was just a rock. Urak's fleet passed within close range of it on their approach vector. The moon opened fire. It did not open fire like a few hidden gun platforms or a small defensive battery. It opened fire the way a fortress opens fire, from dozens of positions at once, from every angle, with weapons that had clearly been installed deep inside the lunar rock over a very long period of time. Rail cannons buried in craters launched solid metal projectiles at speeds that made them hit like small missiles. Clusters of kinetic impactors came out of shafts drilled straight down into the surface and shot upward in coordinated waves. Point defense systems popped up from underneath false rock formations and began picking off Vreth fighters before they could react. It happened in seconds. The lead Vreth ship in the formation, a heavy cruiser named the Iron Claim, took 3 rail cannon rounds in the first 4 seconds. Its shields held for 2 of them. The third one went through. The Iron Claim broke apart and began to drift. The second ship took a kinetic impactor cluster to its engine section and lost power completely. The flagship, the Eternal Dominion, was already turning and raising shields when the first wave hit, and its shields held, but only barely. Urak was thrown from his command chair by the impact. He grabbed the console and pulled himself up and looked at the screen, and for 1 full second he could not understand what he was seeing. The moon was a weapons platform. The humans had built their defense grid inside the moon. "All ships evasive pattern 7, he shouted. "Return fire, target the surface emissions. Move us out of this range now." The fleet scattered. Some ships moved fast enough. Some did not. In the first 6 minutes of the engagement, the Vreth lost their lead cruiser completely, 2 more ships were crippled, and 4 others had taken serious damage. All of this from a rock that the Vreth had not even considered a threat. On Aurum 9, the observation feed was now on the main screen at full size. The chamber had gone very quiet. Counselor Brennak had put down his other file. He was staring at the screen. His mouth was slightly open. Around the chamber, other delegates had stopped what they were doing and turned to watch. Nobody was laughing now. Oris, the young Kethani science delegate, had put down his data pad completely. He leaned forward in his seat. His 4 eyes were wide. On his home world, the Kethani were considered one of the most scientifically advanced species in the Convergence. They had been in space for 3,000 years. They had never been surprised by a primitive world before. He was very surprised now. "They built it inside the moon," he said, to no one in particular. "They hid it inside the moon. When did they, how long did that take?" "Long enough," Velshara said from her seat. Her voice was quiet and flat. She had not moved. She had not looked surprised at all. "They have known something was coming for a very long time, or at least they suspected it, so they prepared." "But they are pre-contact," Brennak said. He was still staring at the screen. "They were not supposed to know about us." "They did not know about us specifically," Velshara said. "They just knew that space was large and that they were not alone in it, and that if something was out there it might not be friendly. So they built something, quietly, and they waited." On the screen, the Vreth fleet had pulled back and was regrouping beyond lunar range. The moon had stopped firing. The craters had closed. The hidden shafts had sealed. From the outside, it looked like a dead rock again. Urak's voice came through on the fleet communication channel, which the Convergence observation feed was picking up. He was speaking to his commanders. His voice was controlled, but only barely. "Damage report. All ships respond." The responses came in one by one. 1 ship destroyed, 2 ships unable to continue, 4 ships at reduced capacity. The rest were functional but shaken. Out of 40 warships in the First Fleet, Urak had lost the effective use of 7 in under 10 minutes. From a primitive world that had no interstellar travel. Urak ordered the Second and Third Fleets to advance and take flanking positions. He ordered his engineers to scan the planet's surface for more hidden installations. He ordered his weapons teams to prepare for a full orbital bombardment approach. He spoke in the clipped, professional tones of a commander who was adjusting his plan, not panicking. But those on Aurum 9, who knew the Vreth well, could hear something in his voice that was not usually there. He was not sure anymore. Velshara finally stood up from her seat. She walked slowly to the center of the chamber floor, which was unusual. She almost never did this. The other delegates who were still drifting in watched her move to the middle of the room and stop there. "I would like to read something to the council," she said. No one objected. She held up her data pad and began reading from the human historical file. She did not read about their technology. She did not read about their weapons or their governments. She read about their wars. She read about the long ones, the ones that lasted years, the ones that burned entire continents, the ones that killed tens of millions of people. She read about what happened after those wars. How the humans buried their dead, rebuilt their cities, wrote down what had happened, and then kept going. She read about the plagues. She read about the famines. She read about the times the planet itself had turned against them, great freezes, great floods, long droughts. She read about every single time the human species had been pushed to the very edge of survival. And then she said, "They are still here. Every single time they are still here." The chamber was silent. "They are not a species that fights because it believes it will win," she continued. "They are a species that fights because stopping is not something they know how to do. They do not have a word in any of their major languages that means giving up is the right choice. They have words for retreat. They have words for regrouping. But giving up," she shook her head, "that is not something they have ever truly accepted." She put the data pad down. "High Warlord Scareth sent 3 fleets to take a world he believed was helpless," she said. "He was wrong about what helpless means. He was wrong about what a species is capable of when it has decided it will not lose." She looked around the room slowly. "And now his fleet commander is standing outside the range of a moon that should not have been able to fight back, and he is trying to figure out what to do next." She walked back to her seat. Oris was already pulling up biological records on his data pad. He started reading about human physiology with an expression on his face that was somewhere between fascination and alarm. Brennak had stopped pretending to do other work. He was watching the observation feed with both hands resting on the table, completely still. On the screen, the Vreth fleet reformed. All 3 fleets now, 120 ships arranged in a vast crescent around the little blue-green planet. From space, it looked like a wall. It looked like the end of something. Below them, on the surface of the Earth, lights were on in every city. Nobody down there was hiding. Nobody was running. They were waiting. The Vreth ground forces landed on 3 continents at the same time. It was a textbook operation. Urak had ordered it after a long session with his generals, going over every scan of the planet's surface they had managed to collect. They had identified the largest population centers, the most important infrastructure points, the communication hubs, the power grids, the government buildings. They had mapped out landing zones in open areas where their dropships could come down without being caught in tight terrain. They had studied the humans' weapons, the ones they knew about, the ones that showed up on scans. Guns, missiles, armored vehicles. Primitive by Vreth standards, but the Vreth were professionals, and professionals did not get careless just because an enemy was outmatched. Urak had told his generals, land fast, secure the key points, show force, demand surrender. The population would see the ships in the sky, the soldiers on the ground, the weapons they could not match, and they would stop. Every species stopped eventually. Even the ones that fought at first stopped when they understood that the cost of continuing was too high. The dropships came down. On the first continent, the landing zone was a large flat area outside a major city. The Vreth soldiers came out in formation, heavy armor, energy rifles, support vehicles that rolled on 6 wide tracks. They were an impressive force. They moved toward the city in a standard advance pattern, expecting either no resistance or organized military units that would engage them in open ground, where Vreth firepower would end the fight quickly. What they found instead was nothing. The streets were empty. The buildings were dark. There was no one in the roads, no one at the windows, no military units waiting in the open. The city looked abandoned. The Vreth advanced carefully, scanning every building, watching every corner. Their sensors picked up life signs. Humans were definitely in there, many of them, but they could not pinpoint exactly where, and the signals were scattered and strange, as though the humans were doing something to confuse the scans. The first Vreth unit turned down a side street. The building on the left side collapsed onto them. It had been prepared, supports cut, charges placed, timed perfectly. 4 Vreth soldiers went down immediately. The others spun around and opened fire at nothing, because there was no one visible, no one standing in the open waiting to be shot. A second later, something hit one of the support vehicles from above. Someone had been on a rooftop. By the time the Vreth looked up, whoever it was had already moved. On the second continent, the landing zone had been a wide field. The Vreth came down and immediately began moving toward the nearest city. They were 2 kilometers out when the ground started going wrong. Holes opened up. Devices buried in the soil went off under their vehicles. Their lead unit lost 2 transports in the first kilometer. The open field that had looked safe and clear from the air was full of things humans had buried there, quietly, while the Vreth fleet was still in orbit deciding where to land. On the third continent, Vreth soldiers entered a forest region on the edge of their target city and discovered that the forest was occupied, not by an army in formation, not by soldiers in uniform standing in rows, by people. Individual people in small groups who appeared and fired and disappeared back into the trees before a countershot could be organized. Vreth soldiers who moved fast got ahead of the main group and were quietly dealt with before anyone noticed they were gone. Vreth soldiers who moved slowly were cut off and surrounded. Soldiers who stayed together were hit with things from far away. Soldiers who spread out found that spreading out in a forest full of humans who knew that forest was not a good idea. The reports started coming in to Urak on the flagship. He read them one by one very carefully, and with each one his expression became harder to read. His generals were sending the same kind of message over and over in different words. The humans were not fighting the way any species the Vreth had encountered before had ever fought. There was no front line. There was no army to defeat, no capital to capture, no command structure to cut the head off. Every city was a maze. Every road was a trap. Every building was a potential fortification. Every open space had something hidden in it. Every forest was a weapon. One of his generals, Commander Thress, sent a personal message instead of a report. It was short. It said, "They are not defending positions. They are defending everything. The entire planet is the battlefield. There is no back line because there is no front line. I need more units and I need them now." Urak stared at that message for a long time. Then he sent back more units. On Orem 9, the council was fully awake now. There was no more background noise in the chamber. No one was reviewing other files or having side conversations. Every delegate was watching the observation feeds, and the feeds were showing things that none of them had expected to see. The view from Vreth helmet cameras showed street after street of empty cities that were somehow not empty. The sound from the feeds was all wrong, distant shots from no visible source. Sudden explosions from places that had been checked and cleared. The sharp crack of something hitting armor and the Vreth voice shouting locations that, by the time they were shouted, were already wrong. Horus had completely abandoned everything else he had been doing. He was now pulling every piece of biological and anthropological data on humans that the Convergence Archive had, and he was reading fast, and what he was reading was making his 4 eyes go very wide. "Their pain response," he said, mostly to himself, but loud enough that the delegates near him could hear. "It is higher than almost any species in our records. They feel pain very strongly." He paused. He read more. "And they continue anyway." He looked up from the pad with a strange expression on his face. Most species with a high pain response have a corresponding behavior. When pain reaches a certain level, the instinct to stop is overwhelming. It is a survival mechanism. You stop doing the thing that is causing pain. He looked back at the screen where a Vreth unit was pinned down behind a vehicle, while shots came from 3 different directions. Humans feel the pain, they register it completely, and then a large number of them choose to continue anyway, not because they do not feel it, because he stopped. He searched through the files again, because of something called will. It appears to function almost like a second instinct that can override the first one. Velshara turned to look at him. "Yes," she said simply, "that is correct." "How?" Oris asked. He was not asking in a dismissive way. He was asking the way a scientist asks when he has found something he genuinely cannot explain. How does a species develop that? What kind of evolutionary history produces that? "The kind where everything is trying to kill you," Velshara said. "Their planet is not gentle. Their history is not gentle. They developed on a world full of things that could end them, and then they spent thousands of years trying to end each other. The ones who survived long enough to pass on their traits were the ones who could keep going past the point where most species would have stopped." She folded her hands. "They are not brave because their lives are easy. They are brave because their lives have never been easy and they are still here." Counselor Brennack had been quiet for a long time. He was a practical administrator, not a military thinker, and what he was watching on the screens was outside his experience. But he understood numbers and he understood outcomes, and the numbers coming in from the Vreth ground operation were not good. "How long can they sustain this?" he asked. "Surely they will run out of people. The Vreth have numbers, equipment." "They have 7 billion people," Velshara said. The chamber went quiet at that. 7 billion, she repeated. On one planet. Most of them have spent their entire lives in a world where conflict of some kind was always somewhere nearby. Many of them have personal experience with hardship of a kind that most species in this chamber have not faced in centuries. And right now, every single one of those 7 billion people knows that something is in their sky trying to take their world away from them. She let that sit for a moment. "Do you understand what that means?" she asked. "It does not matter if the Vreth have better weapons. It does not matter if the Vreth have ships and armor and energy rifles. You cannot win a war against a species that has decided it will not lose, when that species is fighting on its own ground, for its own children, in its own cities, with 7 billion people who are all willing to be the next person to slow you down." Oris set his data pad down very carefully on the table in front of him. He stared at the screen. On the screen, a Vreth unit that had been trying to move through a city block had been stopped completely by what appeared to be 3 humans with equipment that was, by any technical measure, far inferior to what the Vreth soldiers carried. The humans were using the buildings, the streets, the shadows, and something else. The fact that they knew every corner of that city and the Vreth knew none of it. The Vreth unit had called for support twice in the last hour and had not moved forward. "They are fighting their own ground," Oris said slowly, as if he was working something out. "Every human on that planet has lived there their entire life. They know the terrain in a way an invading force never can. Even with better technology, even with better weapons, you are always fighting someone else's home when you invade. And humans..." He stopped and went back to the data pad. "Humans have a specific psychological response to threats against their home and family. It is significantly stronger than their response to threats against themselves. They will accept greater risk and endure greater pain when they are fighting for the people they love than when they are fighting for anything else." He looked up. The Vreth have given them the strongest possible motivation and the home ground advantage at the same time. The room was very quiet. Then Velshara said what she had been building toward since the moment she had read that first human response message. She said it plainly and without drama, because it did not need drama to land hard. "Scareth gave them 48 hours of warning before the attack," she said. "He thought he was being dominant. He thought he was showing them that he was so confident in his victory that he could afford to tell them it was coming." She looked around the chamber. What he actually did was give 7 billion people 48 hours to get ready. And 7 billion people who are ready and angry and fighting for their homes are not the same thing as 7 billion people who were caught off guard. She paused. You do not give humans time to prepare. You do not give humans time to get angry. Because once they are angry and prepared and fighting on their own ground, she shook her head. You gave them 48 hours of warning, she said, one final time. What you actually gave them was 48 hours to get angry. On the observation screen, the Vreth ground operation reports kept coming in. More units pinned down, more losses to traps that should not have been there, more calls for support and reinforcement. And somewhere on the surface below, the humans were moving, not retreating, not collapsing, moving forward, pushing back, reclaiming ground that the Vreth had thought they had taken. Urak received a new report from Commander Thress. It said one thing: they are counterattacking. Urak read it 3 times. Then he ordered his orbital weapon systems to begin targeting civilian infrastructure. He was going to make this hurt. He was going to make them break. Every species broke. He just had to find the right place to push. He did not yet understand that he was about to make the same mistake all over again. He did not yet understand that with humans, making it hurt did not make them break. It made them worse. News of the war reached the far edges of the convergence within 3 days. The observation feeds from Aurum 9 had been classified at first, standard protocol during an active annexation. But feeds leaked. They always did. A technician here, a junior diplomat there, a clerk who thought someone else should see what they were seeing. Within 72 hours of the first lunar defense engagement, the footage of the Vreth fleet getting hit by a moon was playing on communication networks across dozens of star systems. Within a week, every species in the convergence that had access to a broadcast terminal had seen it. And they kept watching, because things kept happening that they had never seen before. Worlds that had been conquered by the Vreth knew what a Vreth annexation looked like. It was fast. It was overwhelming. It was over before anyone had time to really understand what had happened. They had seen it in their own histories, in the records of their own surrenders, the fleet in orbit, the ground forces landing, the government officials signing the documents, the Dominion flag being raised. It usually took days, sometimes less. The war with Earth was now in its 3rd week, and the humans were still fighting. That alone was enough to make the whole galaxy stop and stare. The Vreth had bombed the cities. Urak had given the order carefully, targeting power stations and communication towers and transport hubs, the things that held a civilization together. He had done it with precision. He had done it the way a professional does it, choosing targets that would degrade the enemy's ability to fight without causing the kind of civilian casualties that even some Vreth commanders found uncomfortable. He had been sure it would work. Cut the power, cut the communications, cut the movement of supplies and people, and the enemy's resistance would start to fall apart. It always did. The power went out in cities across 3 continents. The humans switched to backup systems they had built inside mountains. Communication towers went down. The humans rerouted through underground fiber lines and short-range radio networks. Transport hubs were destroyed. The humans started moving supplies on foot, by river, by old roads that did not show up in the Vreth maps because they had been built by hand centuries ago and were too small for scanners to prioritize. Every time a system was taken down, something smaller and harder to find replaced it. The humans had planned for this. Not specifically for this war, not for the Vreth. They had not known the Vreth existed a month ago. But they had spent their entire modern history building backup systems and contingency plans, because their history had taught them that things went wrong and that you needed something to fall back on. They had built redundancy into everything. And all of that redundancy, built up over decades for reasons that had nothing to do with an alien invasion, now worked perfectly against one. On the ground, the Vreth continued to struggle. More units were pinned. More territory that was captured in the daytime was lost again at night, when human fighters who knew the darkness and the terrain moved through it like water and the Vreth, in their heavy armor with their equipment built for open battle, could not keep up. Casualties on the Vreth side were rising in a way that Urak's models had not predicted. His models had been built on how other species fought. Other species fought until the cost became too high, and then they stopped. The humans did not seem to have a number. They did not seem to be calculating cost the way other species did. They just kept going. Urak called a meeting with his senior generals via secure channel. "Give me an honest assessment," he said. "Not what the models say, what you are seeing." General Thress was the first to speak. She had been on the ground for 2 weeks and her voice had changed from the first report she had sent. It was flatter now, careful. "They are not breaking," she said. "The bombing has not broken them. If anything, it has made them more committed. I have intercepted their communications. When their cities are hit, the response is not fear. It is anger, organized anger. I have never seen that response to orbital bombardment before in any engagement." General Voss, who was managing the operation on the second continent, agreed. "The population is not separating from the fighters," he said. "In every other annexation I have been part of, you reach a point where the civilian population begins to separate from the military. They want the fighting to stop. They want to go back to their lives. They pressure their governments and military to accept terms. That is not happening here. The civilians are not pressuring their fighters to stop. The civilians are the fighters. There is no gap between them." "They are one thing," Thress said. "They are all one thing." Urak sat in silence for a moment. Then he asked the question he had been building toward. "What will break them? There must be something." No one answered right away. That itself was an answer. The news had reached worlds that had good reasons to care. 3 small species who had their own complicated histories with the Vreth Dominion were watching the feeds from Earth with something they had not felt in a long time. It took most of them a while to identify the feeling because it was unfamiliar. The closest word in the common galactic language was something that translated roughly as the emotion you feel when someone else does what you wished you had done. The Senari had been absorbed into the Dominion 400 years ago. They had a saying in their own language that translated as, "The wave came and we bent." They had bent because they had no other choice, or so they had believed. They were watching humans who had no ships, no shields, no galactic allies, and who had looked at a wave larger than anything the Senari had ever faced and had not bent. The Orvani had lost 2 colony worlds to the Vreth 80 years ago. Their elders still remembered. They watched the human feeds every day and did not speak much about what they were feeling, but their council representatives had started sitting differently in the chamber, straighter, with their hands visible on the table instead of folded out of sight. A small independent trading species called the Lu quietly began redirecting one of their cargo routes. The new route went closer to the human solar system than the old one. Their ships began carrying certain materials that were not technically military supplies, but that happened to be exactly the kind of materials that a species fighting a ground war and rebuilding bombed infrastructure would need. They did not announce this. They did not file any formal declaration. They just started doing it, and when convergence observers noted the route change, the Lu trade representative shrugged and said that the new route was slightly more fuel efficient. It was not more fuel efficient. No one said anything officially. On Orem 9, the moment everyone would later remember happened on the 22nd day of the war. High Warlord Scareth arrived in person. He came in through the main entrance of the council chamber with his full honor guard, 12 warriors in formal Vreth conquest armor, polished and imposing. He walked to the center platform and he looked, if anything, more confident than he had the first time. Whatever was happening on Earth, he was not going to let this chamber see that it bothered him. He stood at the center of the room, and he said, in a loud and clear voice, that he was requesting the Council formally censure the human species for engaging in aggressive and disproportionate resistance against a legitimate convergence-approved annexation. The silence that followed was unlike any silence the chamber had produced in recent memory. Then something happened that the official record would later describe as an unprecedented breach of council decorum. Someone laughed. It was not a polite, suppressed sound. It was a real laugh from somewhere in the left section of the chamber, and it was followed immediately by another one from the right side, and then a third, and within a few seconds the council chamber of the Galactic Convergence, the most formal diplomatic body in the known galaxy, with 7,000 years of recorded procedural history, was producing open laughter directed at the most powerful military commander the Vreth Dominion had. Scareth stood in the center of the room, and his expression did not change, but something happened behind his black eyes. Councillor Brennack called for order. It took him 3 tries. When the chamber finally settled, Brennack looked at Scareth and said, as carefully as he could, that the Council did not have a legal mechanism to censure a non-member species for defending itself against an annexation, since the right to defend oneself was a fundamental principle that predated the convergence itself. Scareth said that humans had attacked Dominion forces. Brennack pointed out that Dominion forces had entered the human solar system uninvited. Scareth said the Dominion had legal right under Article 9. Brennack agreed that they did, but noted that Article 9 said nothing about the target world not being allowed to fight back. Scareth began to respond, and Velshara, who had not spoken during this exchange, said one sentence. Warlord Scareth, you are in this chamber asking 300 species to help you defeat a world with no ships. She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. I suggest you return to your fleet. Scareth left. He did not respond. He simply turned and walked out, his honor guard moving behind him. After he was gone, Aura stood up. He rarely stood up to speak formally. He was a science delegate, and scientists usually submitted papers rather than making floor speeches. But he stood up and he held his data pad and he said he wanted to present something he had been working on, and Brennack, who was running out of ways to be surprised today, told him to go ahead. Oris called the document he had prepared the Human Paradox. He had been working on it for 3 weeks. It was a compilation of everything the Convergence Archive had on human biology, psychology, history, and behavior, and he had spent 21 days trying to find the framework that explained what he was seeing on the observation feeds. He had found it. Humans feel everything more strongly than most species, he said. Pain, fear, grief, loss. Their nervous systems are highly sensitive and their emotional responses are strong. By every biological measure, they should be a species that avoids conflict, seeks peace, and accepts unfavorable terms when the alternative is continued suffering. That is the normal pattern. Sensitive species are cautious species. He paused. Except that humans also have something else. Something that developed alongside all of that feeling, maybe because of all of that feeling. They have what they call hope, not in a simple way. Hope for humans is not a passive emotion. It is not the feeling that things might get better. It is an active choice that they make repeatedly under conditions where no rational calculation supports it, to believe that if they keep going, something will change. It is irrational. It makes no mathematical sense. And it is the most dangerous thing I have ever encountered in a species profile. He looked up from his pad. You cannot defeat hope with weapons, he said. You can destroy infrastructure, you can kill soldiers, you can bomb cities. But if the species has hope, real, active, chosen hope, then every loss becomes a reason to try harder, not a reason to stop. Every bomb that falls and does not kill them is proof that they survived. Every day that passes where they are still fighting is proof that they can keep going. He set down the pad. The Vreth Dominion attacked a species that has never, in its entire recorded history, permanently lost hope. Not in any war, not in any disaster, not in any catastrophe. He looked at the screen where the feeds from Earth were still running. They are still fighting. They will keep fighting. And I believe, based on everything in this file, that they have something prepared that we have not seen yet, because that is what humans do. They prepare. They adapt. And they always have one more thing that the enemy did not know about. The chamber was very still. On the observation feed, the camera from a Vreth orbital position showed the surface of Earth at night. From space, even with the power outages, there were still lights. Not as many as before, but they were there, scattered across the dark continents like small stars, flickering but present. They had not gone out. Scarath made his decision on the 31st day of the war. He made it alone in the command room of his personal ship, with the door sealed and his generals locked out. He had listened to their reports. He had read every assessment, every casualty count, every failed projection. He had watched the feeds from the ground operations and the orbital engagements. He had seen numbers that should not have been possible, losses that a war against a primitive world should never have produced, territory that should have been secured weeks ago still contested, a population that should have broken still holding together and still pushing back. His generals had begun, very carefully and very diplomatically, to suggest that the Dominion consider alternative approaches. That was how they said it. Alternative approaches. They were too professional to say the actual word, and he was too proud to hear it even if they had. But he knew what they meant. They meant stop. Scarath was not going to stop. Pride was part of it. 37 worlds were carved into his chest piece. He had taken every one of them. He was not going to let the 38th, a pre-contact world that had no business being difficult, be the one that turned him back. But it was more than pride. If the Dominion retreated from Earth, every species in the convergence would see it. Every world that had bent to the Dominion would remember. Every world that was thinking about bending in the future would think again. Retreat from Earth was not just losing one planet. It was losing everything that the Dominion's reputation was built on, which was the certainty that once the Vreth came for you, there was no point in fighting back. He could not allow that. So he made his decision. He was going to end this, all of it, in one strike with everything he had left. He would bring every remaining functional warship into a single concentrated assault formation, and he would commit them all to a full orbital bombardment of the planet's surface. Not targeted, not precise, not careful. Total. The kind of assault that left nothing to rebuild from. It was a thing the Dominion had done before in very rare cases, when a world had proven too resistant to be useful and too dangerous to be left alone. It was the option that commanders were not supposed to reach for because it destroyed the value of the conquest. You could not absorb a planet that was ash. But Scarath had stopped thinking about absorption. He was thinking about the record. He was thinking about the 37 names on his chest plate. He was thinking about what it meant to lose. He called his fleet commanders and gave the order. The remaining ships of all three fleets, 91 vessels, after the losses of the past month, began moving into position. They formed a tight, dense cluster above the planet, high enough to be out of range of the lunar defense grid and low enough for full bombardment capability. It took 4 hours to get every ship into place. When they were all there, Scarath stood at the forward window of his command room and looked down at the blue-green planet below, and he felt, for just a moment, something that he would never have admitted to anyone. He felt relieved that it was almost over. Then Fleet Commander Urak's voice came through on the emergency channel. "Warlord," he said, and his voice was wrong, tight, and strange in a way that Urak's voice had never been in 20 years of service. "Something is coming up from the outer system." Scarath turned from the window. "What?" "Multiple contacts, deep space. They were not there a moment ago. A pause, the sound of consoles in the background. They are reading as weapons platforms, large ones. They are coming up fast." Scarath moved to his tactical screen. What he saw took him a moment to process. From the outer edges of the solar system, from positions beyond the large outer planets, from places where there was nothing but cold, empty space and scattered rocks and silence, things were moving. Not ships, not exactly. They were platforms, unmanned. Large, dark, and moving with clear purpose toward the assembled Vreth fleet. They had been sitting out there in the dark, cold and silent and invisible to Vreth sensors, for what must have been years. Maybe longer. They had been placed there by a species that had no interstellar travel, that was considered pre-contact, that was not supposed to know anyone was out there. A species that had looked at an empty solar system and decided that the smart thing to do was to fill the dark outer edges of it with weapons and wait. Just in case. Urak's voice again. They are targeting solutions locked on. And then the feed cut to the sound of impacts and alarms. The platforms opened fire from every direction at once. The Vreth fleet, packed tightly together in bombardment formation, had positioned itself perfectly for what it was about to do to the planet below. In doing so, it had also positioned itself perfectly for what was about to happen to it. The tight formation that made orbital bombardment effective made evasion nearly impossible. Ships could not scatter fast enough without colliding with each other. Their shields, designed to face threats from below or from the sides, were caught flat-footed by angles that the platforms had chosen with obvious care. The battle lasted 47 minutes. At the end of it, 63 Vreth ships had been destroyed or disabled. The remaining 28 were in full retreat, moving out of the solar system at maximum speed. Scareth's command ship was among them, crippled, running on backup power, leaking atmosphere from 3 separate breaches. Urak did not send a message. There was nothing to say. And then, as the last Vreth ship cleared the outer edge of the solar system, one more transmission came from the planet below. It was directed at Scareth's retreating ship specifically, which meant that the humans had tracked it individually through the chaos of the battle, which was itself a remarkable thing. The transmission was audio only. A voice came through, calm and professional and unhurried, as if the speaker had just concluded a routine meeting rather than a month-long war. Vreth Command Vessel, this is General Amara Os of the United Earth Defense Command. We have tracked your vessel and confirm it is crippled and unable to engage. We are not pursuing. Several of your ships in the battle area are adrift with crew aboard. We are dispatching recovery teams. Your crews will be taken aboard and treated according to our laws of war. They will not be harmed. When this situation is resolved, we are willing to discuss formal terms of cessation. Respond at your convenience. Scareth stared at the communication terminal. They were sending recovery teams for the crew of ships that had just tried to bombard their planet from orbit. They were offering to talk. They had won, completely, decisively, and their first move after winning was to pick up the enemy's wounded. He sat down in his command chair, and he did not move for a long time. On Aurum 9, the council chamber was completely silent. Not the silence of boredom or routine. The silence of people who have just seen something that has changed the way they understand the world, and who need a moment to accept it. The observation feed had captured everything. The platforms rising from the dark, the bombardment formation becoming a trap, the 47 minutes, the last transmission. All of it was on the screen, and every delegate in the chamber had watched it, and nobody was saying anything. Velshara stood up. She walked to the center of the floor for the second time in this crisis, and she stood there, and she looked at her colleagues, all 300 of them, or at least the ones who were present, and she said what she had been building toward since the day Scareth had stood in this same spot and shown them a small blue-green planet. Let the record show, she said in her quiet, even voice, that humanity was never on the protected species list. It was never invited to this council. It was never warned about us, never aided by us, never acknowledged by us. For 200 years, we watched them with unmanned probes and wrote notes in files and classified their world as primitive and pre-contact. and we left them alone not out of respect, but because we did not consider them worth the trouble." She paused. "And in that time, without knowing we were watching, without knowing we were out here, they looked at the sky and decided it might not be friendly. And they prepared." She looked around the room slowly. "The most powerful conquest fleet the Western Spiral Arm has ever seen came to their solar system with 120 warships. It left with 28, and those 28 are damaged and retreating and will not be back. Humanity did this with no allies, no galactic technology, no warning, and no help from anyone in this chamber." She stopped, "and the first thing they did when they won was send ships to rescue the enemy's crew." The chamber was still. "I have a motion," she said. "I move that this council send a formal diplomatic delegation to the human world with an offer of convergence membership, full protection, and first contact recognition. Immediately, before they decide we are not worth talking to." Oris seconded the motion before she had even fully finished the sentence. The vote was called. It was the fastest vote in council history, not because it was rushed, but because for once there was no argument, no delay, no series of amendments and counter-proposals. 312 species, or nearly all of them, voted the same way. Unanimous. Months later, on the surface of the Earth, in a quiet field outside Nairobi, where the grass had grown back green over the places where the ground had been burned, a girl of about 8 years old sat next to her grandmother in the late afternoon light. Her grandmother was a tall woman who sat very straight even now, even here, even in the quiet. She had a scar on her left forearm that she never talked about except to say that it was from the war. She had been a soldier. She was done being a soldier. Now she was sitting in the grass with her granddaughter, watching the light change. The girl had been thinking about something. The way children do, slowly, turning it over, waiting until the moment was right. Finally she said it. "Grandmother, what did it feel like when they came?" The old woman was quiet for a moment. She looked up at the sky, which was clear and orange at the edges from the setting sun. The first star was just becoming visible in the east. It was an ordinary star. It looked the same as it always had. "Scared," her grandmother said. "Everyone was scared." "But you still fought." "Yes." "Why?" The old woman thought about it properly, the way the question deserved. She did not give a quick answer. She looked at the star and she thought about the month of her life that she did not talk about in detail. The sounds, the cold, the long nights, the names of the people who were not here to sit in the grass in the afternoon light with a grandchild. She held all of it in her mind for a moment, and then she set it aside and looked at the girl. "Because you were here," she said simply. "You and everyone like you, everyone who was going to come after. You can be very scared and still do what needs doing when the thing you are doing it for is worth it." The girl thought about that. Then she asked, "Were we always going to win?" Her grandmother smiled. It was a small smile, honest and a little tired. "No," she said. "We were not always going to win. We just decided we were not going to lose. There is a difference." She looked back up at the sky. "There has always been a difference." They sat together in the quiet field as the stars came out, one by one, over a world that was still there.